In the nearly 40 years of investigation of UFOs, I have investigated, I guess, close to 130 unknowns and countless identified flying objects, but the unknowns are the ones that we're interested in. And of those 130, 50 of them are close encounter reports of various types. And of the close encounters, 14 involved entity sightings. And finally, we get down to maybe 3 abduction reports.
We began going around and talking to people who had reported seeing UFOs in this area, asking them if they'd ever seen the beings on board the craft. Oh, yes, they all had. The beings were all beautiful blonde men, 6 foot tall, wearing long white robes. And the doors of the UFO opened, and these beautiful men would say, "Welcome, my child, you have been blessed." And Bonnie and I came home and said, "That's not us."
Well, I've come over from England to this convention, and I brought with me some songs which have come through, I understand, from the space people, and they have a content which I would like to share with people, for I think there's a lot in it that you will understand when you hear. Thank you. There's a cockeyed feeling in the world today. The power of politics is here to stay. The China, Russia, and the USA. Boy, don't let them fool you. Take a look at this world of ours. Just one mud ball in the sea of stars. Oh, the planet's got no color bars, 'cause they've got perspective. Yanks and Ruskies putting head into space, but it's all a mad politician's race. What upmanship in this year of grace, it makes you giggle. The population stands and stares, while men in capsules explore upstairs. Why we can't even manage our own affairs. Some cheap colonization. Besides, they got people on Venus and Mars. They got lads and lasses, they got cars and cars, and they got better transport than four-wheel cars. Have you ever seen them? Those flying saucers whisking through our skies must take some power to make them rise. The government departments just hide their eyes. Call them meteors. With all the lies that they print and shout, the general public has its work cut out, figuring what it's all about, but just you keep on trying. Suppose you know why I'm telling you this, so you won't shriek or shake your fist when you discover Martians do exist. They're real nice fellas.
I see by the newspapers here that Kraft Ericke, head of the Space Flight Division of the American Rocket Society, he recently says, man must prepare soon to meet with intelligences of other solar systems. You know, there are many that feel that this has already happened. Now, with the voluminous file of photographic evidence that we have on hand, it is quite possible that they may be right.
Shortly after UFOs, flying discs or flying saucers, were widely reported in the press in the late 40s and early 50s, there came on the scene a number of people who, because of political or spiritual reasons, felt that aliens from another planet could help us out of our troubles. And whether they had a UFO experience or not, they felt that the kind of philosophy embodied by hopefully objective beings from somewhere else could solve our problems.
Beginning in the early 1950s in Southern California, a movement began centered on the idea that there were certain individuals who were in contact with benevolent extraterrestrials who were called Space Brothers. And among these people were most prominently George Adamski, another was Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, George Van Tassel, Orville Angelucci. These were individuals who claimed ongoing contacts with people from Mars, Venus, and Saturn, and other planets. These Space Brothers were human-like. They were actually better-looking, nicer versions of ourselves. They were here to save us from blowing ourselves up with atomic bombs.
After 1 year's investigation, I believe that the flying saucers seen by veteran airline and Air Force pilots are objects from another planet. The Air Force itself has officially admitted that flying saucers exist. This statement appears in Project Saucer Case number 75. Not only that, the Air Force has officially analyzed the motives of possible visitors from space. Here is a direct quotation from the official report. Such a civilization might observe that on Earth we now have atomic bombs in our fast-developing rockets. In the past history of mankind, they should be alarmed. We should therefore expect at this time above all to behold such visitation.
The Nevada desert in America is the scene of the latest atomic test. International observers come by invitation to join scientists, military and civil defense authorities making a study of the test.
We were living in the shadow of the atomic bomb. Quite literally, it burst on the scene and nobody was able to comprehend the effects that it might have if unleashed in a worldwide scale. I mean, certainly that could happen today, but I guess like UFOs, we're inured to living in the atomic age. But back then it was new. And this meant that people had to rethink their philosophy of life and their philosophy of spirituality. And many people of this philosophical bent looked to the skies for help.
The space people that Fry, Adamski, Van Tassel, and others claimed to have encountered really were preaching an earthbound occult doctrine which is known as theosophy. There was nothing particularly interesting about what they were saying, but it had enormous appeal to some people, and they had a small and committed following. Fry and the other people were essentially bringing flying saucers into a religious context. What the contactee movement represented was a religious response to the UFO phenomenon.
We had several different contacts. I had one of them at Kansas City, Missouri on April 8th, 1958, again in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
You mean that you met with
14th.
these visitors again since
Yes.
I've met with you and spoke with you?
Yes.
Well, just what happened with in that case, Mr. Schmidt? Would you tell the audience, please?
In Tulsa, Oklahoma on April the 14th, 1958, I was picked up by one of these space visitors in their little MiG.
The contactees were very popular. They seemed to have touched a nerve with the public at that time. And they had large followings in the 1950s. But their evidence for UFO experiences were a little questionable. Their photographs tended to be dubious. The more scientific ufologists always didn't care for them, thought they were simply trying to make a buck.
The big name in contactees of the 50s was George Adamski. And he had been actually a spiritual teacher and maybe a kind of a mini guru as far back as 1939. And had, tinkered around with cameras as well, too. So when UFOs began in 1947, you might say, he took a lot of pictures of them. Probably fake pictures as we look back on it now. And he had like hundreds of them.
Now, when you produce a photograph of an alien or a spaceship, either you have a real photograph of an alien or a spaceship, or you consciously fabricated it. So in the case of the physical contactees, it was a very simple question. Are these guys telling the truth, or are they lying? Are they consciously fraudulent?
Sid Patrick says that he has been aboard a flying saucer. And our first question, Sid, is what was this flying saucer like?
Well, to answer that, I would like to show the charts which I have provided for this this kind of answer.
All right, now, this is the spacecraft, is that right?
That is right. That's just the way it appeared as I was approaching it to go aboard, as they had asked me to come aboard. They had invited me aboard.
Is that the door at the bottom?
It is.
Having been aboard the spacecraft, Sid, can you tell us what the layout aboard the craft was?
Yes, I can. I have with me a chart which is in all respects identical to the lower floor. This is the second floor, and it's in all respects the same with the exception of the consultation room. I might point out that in the traveling through the craft, we went through a total of 14 rooms, and we saw 8 other persons, 7 more men and 1 lady.
My name is Chief Frank Buckshot Standing Horse. I am an Ottawa Indian. And in 1959, on July the 12th, I took a trip in a flying saucer. This saucer I went up into was to Mars, over the moon, Venus, Clarion, and Orion. When I say Orion, I do not mean Orion. It is a planet outside of our galaxy. And I was gone 4 days and 4 nights and 2 half nights. The captain of the THE.VHS, which is the name of this flying saucer, her name was Mandra Olika, a very beautiful woman. She gave me the age of 417 years old. That was in 1959. She was tall, dark-complected, beautiful blue eyes, well-shaped, and she certainly was blessed with beauty.
The early contactees were persons who claimed that they had been taken aboard UFOs, which they call flying saucers at that time, and that the occupants were fully human, beautiful, usually blonde, and sometimes a very nice-looking lady. And the contactee would engage in philosophical discussions, socio-economic discussions of all types.
The contactee was someone who reported having conscious discussions and meetings with aliens. Usually Venus was a typical place, Mars, maybe Jupiter, whatever.
They all met beautiful aliens, very friendly, came down, and they all warned humans that they must stop nuclear testing, must stop war, and they all had rather platitudinous philosophical messages.
I was within a few feet of the craft. I went through an all-night experience and I was shown things of the future of the civilization.
This is the center for the distribution of information coming to me telepathically from the space people.
While I was on the craft, they presented me with this little crystal stone. They told me it was called Martian jasper. This craft, by the way, was from the planet Mars.
You've never made any contact with people inside the ships?
Not inside the ship, sir.
What does that mean?
Well, I have had a contact, but not inside the ship, and I prefer not to relate it in detail at this time.
Yes, I've seen them. They, or rather, one of them came out. I only saw one.
Can you describe him?
Well, it looked like a she, about 7 feet tall, and had long flowing hair and an ebony black skin.
3 of our monks were on retreat up around Lake Tahoe. We were all sleeping in sleeping bags, and we all awakened right at the same time, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and saw a flying saucer go completely across the horizon. It was just a gorgeous sight. It was the first one we had ever seen.
At about this point, his friends would say, "Look, Joe, why don't you just go back to your hut and sleep it off? How can you expect us to swallow all of this ridiculous nonsense? Everything you say is contrary to everything we know."
There is, in fact, other forms of life that we don't know of, and quite a few things on this planet that we don't know of, that we learn only by experience.
There are forms of life here on this planet that we don't think much about, but we become acquainted with them here without really realizing it.
In the 50s, contact with what passed for UFO people or aliens was pretty benevolent. You met your long-haired Venusian in the desert, and they gave you a taste of what it was like to be a space brother. But with Betty and Barney Hill case, which was the first abduction case to really take the popular consciousness by storm, things changed. The aliens became little guys who didn't look that human at all, and they did kind of crazy things to you, like take you on board their spacecraft and perform operations of a very mysterious and disturbing nature. That really was the turning point in ufological history, because it paved the way for acceptance among ufologists and even among the general public that the UFOs were not only here, but they were here and wanting to do something to us.
The Betty and Barney Hill abduction case, which occurred in 1961 but really didn't come to public attention until 64 or 65 when there was a magazine article on it and then a book, was the first U.S. abduction case that the public and ufologists were aware of. It turns out now that there were many cases before that.
I'm Betty Hill, and my husband Barney and I were the first persons on this planet to be abducted by astronauts from another solar system.
My very first UFO close encounter case was the Hill case back in 1961, which everybody is familiar with by now. That was a landmark case, or it turns out to be a landmark case, because it was the first publicized missing time abduction case. I didn't know it at the time, but it sort of set the standard for all the abductions to follow.
We saw what we thought was a new star in the sky, and at that point it began to move and went across the face of the moon, so we stopped the car to get out to look at it, because now we know it's not a star, it's possibly a satellite. Barney decides to get out with the binoculars in an attempt to identify this craft. And he gets out, I stay in the car. He looks up at the craft and he sees human-like figures standing behind the windows, looking down at him, and the craft began to descend. And he had got the impression they were trying to capture him, trying to grab him. He ran back to the car. We went speeding down the highway to avoid capture. There was a series of beeping sounds. And then, for some unexplained reason, Barney left the main highway onto a secondary road, and we found ourselves next on a dirt road. Just before we got to the dirt road, we saw what we thought was the moon setting. And you could see the silhouette of trees in front of it. And then the dirt road, we could remember leaving the dirt road, finding our way back, and when we came into Ashland, back on the main highway, we heard the beeping sounds again, and we came home.
I was asked to drive to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which I did, to interview the couple. Of course, this being a close encounter case, I had never come up against one like this, or any before. I was skeptical, although I think it's a good idea to be skeptical when you go into any of these cases. But after I was finished grilling them for 6 or 7 hours, I was very impressed with their story and with them as witnesses.
There are 11 of these beings. They're for purposes of identification. We call one the leader, because he seemed to be in charge, and he was the one who spoke to us in English. Then there was the examiner, who did the testing, and then there were what we call crew members, because they stayed outside in the corridor. There were 9 of them. Now both Barney's and my exams basically were very much similar. They checked our eyes, ears, nose, throat, took samples of our hair, scraping of our skin, were very interested in our feet. And then with me, they put me on the table and tried to insert a needle-like instrument in my navel. He said it was a pregnancy test. And I said that was no pregnancy test, and it wasn't in those days. It was unheard of on this planet.
Betty, within 2 weeks of the encounter had had a series of nightmares, very unusual dreams. And she alluded to the possibility that maybe the missing time that they had experienced on their trip home had something to do with the dreams. In the dreams, they drove off the main highway down a side road in a heavily wooded area. They were stopped, and by alien entities, they were taken on board, examined, and then released. At the time, since we had never run up against anything like this, I assumed that the first encounter along the highway was all there was to it, and that perhaps these were wish fulfillment dreams or some such thing that Betty had. What if they had been kidnapped? What if it had happened further down the road and her mind manufactured the rest of it? And by the way, Barney had no recall at all of the abduction at that point.
Particularly where Barney was closed-minded. This created quite a bit of emotional turmoil for him. And he began to having health problems. And anxieties, fluctuating blood pressure, stomach problems and all. And he wasn't responding to medication. So his doctor thought maybe Barney had some kind of emotional hang-up of some kind that was preventing him from getting back on his feet. So he sent Barney in to a psychiatrist who was in the same building he was in. And Barney started going to the psychiatrist on a regular basis, talking about his early childhood and all. And one time Barney went in and the psychiatrist said, asked Barney, well, what did you do this weekend? And Barney told him we went up in the mountains looking for this spot. So he began questioning Barney about this, and as a result, referred both Barney and me to Dr. Benjamin Simon.
Both of them then, 3 years later, were hypnotized by Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston, and both had abduction scenarios, as we all know.
This creature, this leader, is telling me something. How? I can see it in his face. You see it? Let's move. No. I'm sorry, moving. He's just telling me, don't be afraid. Stay there. You keep looking. Did you hear him tell you this? Oh, no. He didn't say it. You felt he said it. I know. I'll take it in my head. All right. Pull the binoculars away. God, give me strength. All right. Pull them down. Run! Pull the binoculars down and run. God! If there's a God, give me strength. I gotta get away. Oh! Hey! We gotta get away, buddy! All right. Calm down. Calm down. I'm tired. I gotta get away. Oh. Calm down. You're still asleep.
I said to him, this has been quite an experience that no one would ever believe me. And that what I needed was some proof that this had really happened. He laughed. Will you come back? Can we work out something? And he said, I don't know. It's not my decision to make. If we decide to come back, we'll be able to find you all right. And I said, but I don't live around here. I don't live in this area. And he said, we'll find you. And I said, how? How will you find me? I remain the people. And he said, we will. We always do find those we want to. And I said, well, now what do you mean by that remark? And he just laughed.
I had a special interest in one aspect of this since my field is astronomy. After one of the hypnosis sessions, Betty drew from memory a sketch of a star map that her guide or the leader aboard the UFO showed to her. Actually, it was not a two-dimensional map at all, but more like a three-dimensional hologram.
I don't know if there was an opening in the wall or just what, but all of a sudden here's the map. It didn't pull down or anything like that. And it was probably about 2 by 3 feet. And it was almost, it was so realistic, it was almost like looking at the sky. And even some of the objects even seemed to be slowly moving. He asked me if I knew where we were on the map, and I told him no. And he said, well, if I didn't know any basic information, then it would be impossible for him to show me where they were from. And with that, he put the star map, pushed something, and the map was gone.
The two largest stars appeared to be just objects in the foreground, therefore that showed up large. And these appeared to be the base stars. There were heavy lines running between these two stars, indicating heavy traffic, trade routes. In fact, the leader explained it that way. There were solid lines going out to several other stars where they apparently traveled, and then dotted lines or dashed lines going to others which were remote outposts. One visit to these stars or less frequent visits. Years later, Marjorie Fish, an Ohio school teacher, decided to take the star map and to see if it matched reality, to see if there really was a 12-star pattern like this in the heavens.
Now, later, in the research of the star map, I was contacted by a school, at that time she was a school teacher by the name of Marjorie Fish in Ohio. And we wrote back and forth several times. And then she said she'd like to come here and talk to me in greater detail about the star map. And she spent several days with me, asked me numerous questions. And when she went home, she started building models. She took boxes, strings. And she started out and she put our solar system in the middle and started working out so many light years.
So over a period of 6 years, she built three-dimensional models of the sun's neighborhood of stars, moving ever outward.
And when she had finished, she had almost all the same stars in the same pattern that I had in the star map, except two were missing. And so she wasn't able to complete the research until our astronomers found these two stars in 1969.
She had expected in the beginning to come up with random, easily duplicate random patterns, that they would show up quite often, looking like Betty Hills, but that was not the case. She didn't find any until the 6th year. And she discovered it by lying on her back on the floor and looking up at an odd angle. The whole 12-star pattern flashed into view. All the stars have been identified, and making it even less likely that this is a random choice. All 12 stars that are hooked up by solid lines or dashed lines turn out to be life candidate stars. They have spectra that are very similar to our own sun. They are good candidates for planets, and the planets in turn would be good candidates for life. So what is the likelihood of finding 12 stars connected in this manner in this huge volume of space with 100 or more stars? And only these are the life candidate stars in this volume, and all of them have been connected as if visited by these intelligences.
Of course, the Betty and Barney Hill case is one of the most significant cases in UFO research in general, let alone in terms of abductions cases. The reason why I feel that that's an honest remark on my point is that the Hill case occurred early enough in the UFO phenomena that the people doing the reporting, Betty and Barney, were not what we would call idea or concept polluted. There had not been a lot of imagery in the field that would suggest some of the things that they talked about. Also, there are other intriguing aspects of the Hill case. Namely, it was done by an outstanding hypnotist who knew his job. Also, the fact that there were two people who apparently gave at least partially independent testimony that was corroborated, and then, of course, the famous star map aspect of the case. The fact that Betty Hill's testimony seems to still make a certain degree of logical sense, and the story flows kind of consistently from one end to another, sets it as one of the real classic cases of ufology and something that is not easily dismissed by the skeptics, no matter what they would like to say.
It was an interesting conjunction of affairs. If Barney Hill had not responded as, in a sense, badly as he did to the experience, and had not had so many, let's say, psychological problems, sleep disturbances, ulcer problems, and so forth afterwards, it wouldn't have gotten to a doctor. And it had to be a particular doctor who would send him to a psychiatrist who would look for a buried trauma. So it was a series of interesting coincidences and accidents that brought the very first case out. And at any step of the way, if certain things hadn't happened the way they did exactly, medically and in terms of good investigators looking into it, Walter Webb and others, it might have taken another decade before these things came to light.
Bud Hopkins and I have talked about how to work with children, and kind of simultaneously we both had an idea of doing some kind of like, well, like what you'd have with a police lineup, you know, you show kids a bunch of cards and get their reactions to different pictures. And he went ahead and had developed, by an artist, a series of drawings of like a policeman and Batman and a little girl and a skull and a witch and the Ninja Turtle and then an alien face. Also a skull, because that's similar, but it's not the same. And the idea of the test, you can use it a number of different ways. One, you can just see if there's any reaction from the child. Two, you can have the child tell a story about each one, or to save time, you may have the child pick two and tell a story about each one.
So I show a set of 10 drawings to a child in the context of playing with the child. This is always a game. And I show them Santa Claus, Batman, etc. And the basic question is just, do you know who these people are, what these are?
What you get then is a projective test. However, if there are things perhaps going on with the child, he's likely to use details which either consciously or subconsciously are available to him. It's an interesting test without really digging in or telling a child what you think's going on, just to see what comes up.
Recently, as an example, working with a 3.5-year-old child whose mother's a psychiatrist. And it was another psychiatrist, friend of the family, was administering the test to the little girl. I was just there. And this was a game, you know, the little girl was. And she went through just very simple Santa Claus, Batman, policeman, like that. Came to the alien. She said, that's the man that comes in my room at night. And he comes in and we float out the window and we go up a blue light and we go up into this room. And she said, and Mommy, you're up there sometimes. I've seen you on a table and you haven't had any clothes on, etc., etc. Mother, of course, pretty much having a difficult time handling this.
He has interviewed 140 people who have been abducted, and their amazing and frightening stories are recorded in his new book. It's called Intruders, The Incredible Visitations at Copley Woods. Please welcome Bud Hopkins.
A psychologist friend of mine asked me, would I like to meet Bud Hopkins? And she explained that he was interested in people who believed that they had been abducted onto UFOs. And my reaction to that was that this is ridiculous. He must be some sort of strange person. And she said, no, 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 he takes it really seriously.
Bud Hopkins, of course, is the fellow whose name is most associated with ufology and abductions, though many people may instead know Whitley Strieber because of his best-selling books. But when we talk about Bud first, he's an artist, always has been, lives in Manhattan, and got involved with abduction cases in the mid to late 70s, and has written 2 books on the subject, and now spends essentially all of his time looking into abduction cases. He got involved because it was chance. I mean, basically, he looked into a case that turned out to be an abduction case. He was fascinated by it. He decided to stick with it. One of the reasons is nobody else was looking into them.
There are, of course, many people who are interested in doing research on abductions in this country. That's kind of natural because that is one area in ufology where you have a chance to interact with at least part of the experience, namely the experiencer, on a continuing basis and on a basis in which might ultimately lead to some concrete information that's at least a little bit under the control of the researcher. So we have people like Bud Hopkins, of course the most famous UFO researcher, let alone abductions researcher in the world, and my opinion of Bud's work is that it's kind of a classical foundation for the modern study of UFO abductions.
What we do is, in effect, a de facto kind of therapy. Though we're not therapists and we're not trained. Of course, many of the people are trained. Dr. Mack, of course, is brilliantly trained, but lots of the people who work in this field, or at least some, haven't that much training. We have had to improvise because we are helping people through these experiences, which are extraordinarily traumatic. The basic thing about working with, let's say, a professional therapist working with a Vietnam vet who is suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, at least they can assure that vet that the war is over. They're not in the war anymore. I mean, the memories are there, but they're not in it. But I can't assure any abductee that they're out of the war.
What struck me about these individuals was how ordinary they were. I mean, they're very nice people, very somewhat interesting, but not, from a psychiatric point of view, particularly remarkable. They weren't, again, people that had an axe to grind or seemed to have some particular self-promoting aspect to them. They were just people to whom this, as they described it, rather extraordinary phenomenon had happened.
The Kathy Davis case is another important case in Bud Hopkins' Intruders. Kathy Davis also has had a string of encounters over the years. But the one that I think is most impressive to me is the 1983 episode, one of the few examples of an abduction case where physical traces were left behind. The soil there was totally changed. You know, within a couple of days it was very clear all the grass had died and the soil had been baked into a rock-like hardness that has not been duplicated in the laboratory yet, taking control soil. We don't know what kind of energy was brought to bear to seal and kill the soil in a certain way. But most important, the next door neighbor saw through the trees at the moment that this the abduction apparently ended. She saw a gigantic flash just exactly in that spot, and some object started to come over her house, making a roaring sound which was interfering with the electricity. She was in a total panic. She thought there was perhaps an earthquake happening. The lights began to flicker, and finally all the lights went out. It's interesting that the screen of the television set, color television, went red. The other colors had dropped out. Two neighbors heard a roar about the same time as this encounter happened. Their houses shook. They had electrical malfunctions. Plus, before hypnosis, Kathy had a conscious memory of the landed UFO. The Kathy Davis case was the most important case that I've worked on, simply because it did establish once and for all the central focus of the abduction phenomenon upon reproductive issues, genetic issues. When she finally told me that there was this disappeared pregnancy without any sign of a miscarriage connected with with an abduction experience, it immediately rang a few bells in me, in my memory, with other cases where I had deliberately looked the other way when apparently reproductive subjects, aspects of the physical exam were being reported.
One of the reasons why allegedly aliens are taking people, particularly, well, both men and women really, is to get genetic samples of their actual sperms and egg. Now, on the surface, this doesn't make much sense. In fact, genetically, biologically, I can't think of hardly any reason why they would be doing this. But, okay, nevertheless, not only do they seem to take such samples, but sometimes women report what we call false pregnancies, which is that they are literally pregnant, and they think the pregnancy was induced by these creatures. And then after, let's say, 2 or 3 months, they have an abduction where the baby is removed from their womb, and the next day they get up and there's no there's no pregnancy. It's gone. Their doctor can't explain it.
I have something like 4 or 5 cases where women have described experiences at the age of 4 years old or 5 years old of a needle going into the abdomen region of the ovary and another needle simultaneously going in the vagina. And these are tiny little girls who are, you know, through the ova are there, but they're not mature. But sperm samples are taken from men, etc. Now this is going up through, obviously after puberty, and then that person may be reabducted at intervals for the next many years. When I got these cases over and over again, I found myself feeling a little uncomfortable around them. And the Kathy Davis case focused very directly on the idea that she had been somehow used in some way in some kind of very clinical experiment having to do with reproduction. And at this point, we're looking into a case where a woman, for instance, went to bed 7 months pregnant and woke up in the morning after the room filled with a blue light, and she was quite terrified. She woke up in the morning with no baby and no sign of a miscarriage. And a 7-month-old fetus does not disappear overnight without any sign of a miscarriage. I have just dozens and dozens and dozens of cases. But this establishes what I think is the central purpose of the whole thing. There's some kind of attempt to create some sort of hybrid creature or race or species or who knows what to call it.
But you've investigated 145 of these cases. Other investigators have investigated a great number of others. We know now of hundreds and hundreds of these cases in a number of different countries. We get the impression that this is a widespread phenomenon. How widespread, do you think?
Well, it is extremely widespread. The numbers are just staggering in their implications. I mean, we're talking about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. And the reason I can say that is that in any kind of just simple sample, like a radio program, a call-in program, in which case we've been able to follow up with some of the people, and we have some estimate of what the audience is of this program, and the number of people who will respond in, let's say, in a given program, 12 people will turn up from a fairly widely played radio program, reporting this kind of thing, and we can look into even 4 of them, and those cases, and they check out, and these are classic abduction cases. The numbers have to be absolutely gigantic.
One of the things that I think is very important is that the phenomenon be recognized as being as important as it is. The range of numbers of people that are thought to have had these experiences from something like 100,000 to 1 million in this country alone.
I think while it's unwise to put any number on how many abduction experiences there have been, I think any estimates that go well above the thousands are not justified whatsoever by the current amount of data we have. On the other hand, we know we can say that we have hundreds of them because we definitely do. We have hundreds of them. So my guess is that somewhere in the thousands, low thousands, is what I would want to propose.
Let's assume that somebody says 1% of the population. Well, we have, what, 250 million people. That's a lot of people just to start with. If you imagine 10% of the population, you've got 25 million people. Somewhere in these numbers, I think we may find the correct percentage. It's absolutely staggering. I don't know what the numbers are, but they're going to be a lot larger than anybody imagines.
I would say that it does seem likely that there is a very large number. You know, at first we found Barney and Betty Hill. We thought that was a unique phenomenon. 10 years later, we started finding more and more cases, and this thing has snowballed ever since, till finally investigators are just overwhelmed. So it does seem like there is a vast number of cases, but any accurate estimate is going to take a lot more work.
I don't think that we really have enough information to make a judgment on how many people believe they've had abduction experiences. I think that to get some sense of what the numbers are, we're going to have to do a formal survey. My guess is that the higher the number, the more likely we are dealing with some kind of psychological experience. The lower the number, the more probable the interpretation that we're really dealing with some kind of event-level external experience.
I did a study of UFO abductions called UFO Abductions, The Measure of a Mystery. It was sponsored by the Fund for UFO Research. It was originally intended to be a catalog of the abduction cases in the literature, simply a way of bringing together what had become a rather scattered and extensive literature. I was able to find about 300 cases in the literature.
The abduction phenomenon is interesting as a phenomenon simply because you have a body of testimony from people who seem sincere and sane describing the same sorts of events down to really small details. In other words, this does not seem to be a collection of random fantasies, but an actual phenomenon that's somewhat lawful. And when you have something like that, you can really begin an investigation. That's where you start. If you can establish that something is happening, something that has certain features that manifest consistently wherever they happen, wherever in the world, you have something to work with. And from there you can go looking for physical evidence, multiple witnesses, and all those sorts of things.
The UFO abduction phenomenon, taken in its most strictest sense, is a recent phenomenon. The cases that have gone on record started, as a public phenomenon with the Hill case in 1966, but there was an earlier case in 1957, and a few possible cases from the 1950s. It's only about the mid-1970s that a fair number of cases start coming out. Now, there may be two reasons for this. One suggestion has been that, well, once these stories started becoming popular, a lot of people wanted to join in the bandwagon. Another is that people have had these experiences all along. They just didn't know who to tell, and they didn't, in some cases, didn't even know what had happened to them. They were just sort of sitting on this mysterious experience. Finally, they heard of some other cases, recognized their own experience, and then knew who to tell, and that's when the floodgates opened and these stories started coming out.
The reason the cases are now becoming public commonly is because the material is getting out into, let's say, general public awareness, thanks to books and films and TV and so forth. So there is a kind of channel by which people can report, channel's a bad word, conduit by which people can report their cases.
The physical evidence for UFO abductions takes any number of forms. One, you get physical after effects. People may be sick the day immediately after. They may have eye irritation. That's a very common after sequel of the abduction. One very commonly cited bit of evidence is a form of scar.
And then, of course, we have the patterns of the scars on people, which essentially boil down to two different types: a long, straight line, thin, scalpel-like cut. And we have, of course, the round, what we call scoop marks, as if it's a little indentation, as if a layer of cells has just been lifted out. And those turn up over and over again in these cases. And they are generally in the same kinds of places on the body. And they look exactly the same. And the people have the same kind of uneasiness about these.
If the abduction events are real and people are actually examined in the way they're described, then there might be physical effects left on their bodies, scars and so forth. Because people describe instruments placed in their body, they describe cuts made to take out tissue samples and so forth. Now, some abductees have little scars and marks on their body. Question is, what's the cause, what's the effect, what came first, the memory, the scar, and so forth. The most interesting are scars that the abductee allegedly was unaware of until after the hypnosis even. There are cases that I've heard of from Bud Hopkins where the abductee will, under hypnosis, remember a procedure, let's say, in the back of their knee, which is a place most people don't look too often. They'll then look in the back of their knee and they'll find perhaps a scar, maybe this long, or a little scoop mark.
Now, certain physical evidence is claimed, such as scars and other kinds of marks on the body. I am not overly impressed with that particular aspect of the evidence. All human beings, I think almost without exception, have not lived in crystal glass cages all their life, and they have little scars on their bodies. So things happen. You don't necessarily have recollections of these minor injuries, which still, in fact, can leave a noticeable scar. I think that type of evidence is soft at this point. Now, in terms of implants, There we have the opposite situation.
We are studying several objects which have come out of people's bodies that shouldn't be there. The nature of these objects is not clear-cut as to, well, let's say they don't have the bells and whistles, and they're not beeping and transmitting and doing things that we might think an extraterrestrial implant should be doing. But they are very unusual in many respects. They seem to have a lot of organic elements in them. We don't know, we cannot establish that these things so far are totally beyond believability as belonging to Earth. They shouldn't be in the places that they're found.
One of the thoughts is that the so-called aliens, somehow track people by leaving these implants in them, and somewhat the way we track animals, that we leave implants and then we can find them again later on, and that's the way they come back and find the person again. I don't know.
In a number of cases, there are allegations that there's physical evidence associated with the experience of phantom pregnancies, scars, marks, implants, those sorts of things. We're very early in the investigation of these sorts of things, and the documentation so far is slight. In other words, we don't really have a good medical case history of a phantom pregnancy. We have a lot of allegations from people who seem sincere, but we don't have the documentation. Some alleged implants are being found and studied quietly by well-qualified scientists in laboratories. And in one or two cases, I think they found something quite interesting. But again, this, like so much else involved in abduction study, is in its infancy. The really interesting discoveries will be coming in the next months and years.
The geography of abductions is predominated by North America. Most of the cases have come from there. The second largest number have come from England. We get a fair number of cases out of South America, some from Australia and New Zealand. Very few from continental Europe, and none that I know of from Asia. The stories from one country or another are largely the same. There are a few differences. In England, they tend to find describe the beings in different ways than they do in America, but by and large, the stories are pretty much the same.
We're used to the North American type, the little gray guys, that even Betty and Barney Hill were involved with, and certainly Whitley Strieber saw, and many of Bud Hopkins' cases involve very skinny entities with large head, big eyes. We're all kind of used to that. But what kind of gets shoved under the table because we have a North American bias is the fact that in England, many of the abduction cases there involve very human-like beings, but they're Nordic-looking, and they often have long beards and long flowing robes. So you have a Nordic type, and they don't look like the little gray guys at all, but they're doing the same kind of abduction things, like taking people on board involuntarily and subjecting them to medical tests. In some cases, these robed people, kind of like Merlin almost, are working in conjunction with another alien type, which seems to be some kind of drone that doesn't look like the North American little gray guys, but nonetheless they're just as stupid and ugly. These kind of things come into prominence in Latin America as the major abductors. And so you see a cultural bias here.
A major rejection of the UFO phenomena has been that UFOs can't be real because when people report them and their occupants, they say their occupants have a humanoid form. Head, eyes, and face more or less as we have them, and then a torso, two arm-like objects, two leg-like objects, humanoid form, usually not looking exactly like us, but we recognize what all the parts are about anyway.
The entities were described as about 5 foot tall. They were slender, with slender heads which matched, you know, the rest of their slender bodies, completely clothed in dark garments, which seemed to be some sort of thermal insulation from our atmosphere. And the faces were not seen because they too were hidden behind part of the garment.
Some things are losers and some things are winners in the design game of life. And we have found out through 4 billion years of earthly experimentation by Mother Nature what the winning design is. The design features have to have this head end with all of these sense perceptors up there close to the brain. The food intake is there. It goes down a long tube. It's processed. It goes into some kind of a fluid system. That fluid system must be pumped. It cannot go by osmosis. There has to be a branching circulatory system. There has to be some kind of a pump in there to move it around. This thing is also going to end up, if it's ambulatory and technical, having a certain number of limbs.
The other type of entity was the more typical type that you think of when you think of UFO abduction, the pasty-skinned, whitish-gray, spindly-bodied type, which is about 4 feet tall, with an overlarge head and tremendously large hypnotic eyes.
Humanoid form is going to be something that is a logical potential development on many, many worlds. It's not something that's random. You're not going to expect to walk up and shake hands with a pancake the first time you see something in outer space. The argument that UFO phenomena are automatically to be rejected as far as having anything to do with extraterrestrials because people report humanoid life forms is unfortunately ignorant baloney at this stage.
Ah, here's a nice little house. Smoke coming from the chimney. Probably one of those old-fashioned fireplaces. Good morning, sir. I said, good morning, sir. 4 eyes and 4 legs. Not much resemblance to my chart. Better look around some more. Well, this is more like it. Wowee. How do you do, sir? I'm Bebop Bobap. I'm here to demonstrate. George, help!
We're speaking with Mrs. Linda Soul and family from Nacogdoches, Texas. Mrs. Soul, why have you come to Fort Smith to this UFO convention?
Because I'm interested in UFOs, and I wanted to see what all the speakers had to present, different ideas, and how objective it was.
Now, you told me a little earlier that you have seen UFOs. Is this true?
Yes.
And there was another major school of contactees that didn't get as much attention in the early days because of the flamboyant claims of Adamski, Fry, and others. These were people who claimed to receive psychic messages from benevolent extraterrestrials. These messages came through a voice in the head, through automatic writing, visions, dreams, those sorts of things. By the 1970s, there were all kinds of people around, and not many people were paying attention to them. And finally, Leo Sprinkle, who was a psychologist at the University of Wyoming, got interested in these people and entered into correspondence with them. He began giving them psychological tests, trying to figure out what kind of people believed they'd had these sorts of experiences. Then beginning in 1980, he began holding yearly UFO conferences where these people would get together with other contactees and they would exchange stories and tell each other their experiences and so on. These meetings have been going on ever since then. And so Leo Sprinkle has really had a lot to do not only with noticing and documenting this movement, but helping to perpetuate it just by giving these people a forum.
I think it's important that people accept an abduction for what it is. Because I have met people at various UFO symposiums and things who deny the fact that they were abducted, even though all those telltale signs, you know, you can read them off. They may say this, they may say that, but they go through denial. So they have to want the help. And that only begins by accepting what has happened to you.
Can we deny an abduction and be a contactee?
I don't know. But that's where it has to start. They have to accept what has happened to them, and then they can move on to get some help.
See, I think the word abduction, it means to be taken against your will. It's a negative concept word. Mm-hmm. And I feel that there's a lot of negativity and a lot of victimization of the contactees simply because someone, I mean, all right, you're walking along, you meet some beings, they take you on their ship and they bring you back. Well, you're kind of going through the natural trauma reaction, which is a normal human reaction to any abnormal event. And you don't really know what you feel. And they come up and they say, my God, you're abducted, you know. as opposed to saying, you just had a contact experience, and the negative influence of abduction, captors, I mean, the whole thing puts a real negative victimization aspect on the whole phenomena that isn't really necessary. Bill and I have had this discussion about 6 times. You know, I
we
say,
go back and forth.
were you contacted or were you abducted? You know, I've been.
I was taken, for sure.
There you go. That's better than being abducted.
But it felt like I was abducted.
In the Bible, particularly in the letter to the Thessalonians of St. Paul, there's a description of what is supposed to happen at the time of the second coming, when Jesus returns. And the description in Thessalonians is sometimes called the rapture, you know, the word. And so that it is said by St. Paul that at that moment we will just be taken up into the clouds to meet the Lord at the moment of the second coming. And it seems to me that you could properly describe modern abduction experiences as in some sense fulfilling or fitting the description of the rapture. However, the word rapture has an ambiguity about it. The Latin root of the word raptus means literally lifted up, carried away. And the word rapture has the connotation of ecstasy. When we say we're carried away, I was ecstatic over the experience. That's a positive experience. That would be stressing the positive aspect of the rapture. But the word rapture is also related to the word rape or abduction. And that's the negative side. And so it seems to me that both aspects of the raptus, of the rapture, are represented in modern ufological experiences.
I've always been interested in UFOs my whole life. I live in Buffalo, Wyoming, and in 1983, Dr. Leo Sprinkle came to give a workshop on UFOs, and I attended that, and about 4 days later, I started having recurring dreams of a recurring dream I had as a child. The dreams of being in a boomerang-shaped airplane, being in a round airplane. And 3 years ago I came to the conference here in Laramie, and Dr. Sprinkle regressed me to find out about these dreams I had.
I was abducted just about a year ago, last July. I was on a camping trip up near Reno, Nevada, alone. I was camping alone, and had gone into the city of Reno to try to make some money. And as I approached my car, it's around 11:30 at night, as I approached my car, which was parked on the street, a group of people, a cluster of people, was walking toward me. And as I got just about up to my car, I could tell that these people were walking in unison. I thought that was a bit unusual. And I began slowing down, and they were about approximately 15 feet away. I realized that these were not real people. And at that point, I said, run. And of course, at that point, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move.
My first conscious knowledge of an experience was at 8 years old when I lived in Alaska. I was getting out of school, and I saw a moose on top of the hill behind the school. And I said, oh, great. So I decided to go check the moose out. So I went up the hill, and there was no moose, but there was a round airplane. For an 8-year-old, it was an airplane at that time. I don't know how I got in the craft. It was a small craft. The seats were small to fit my size as an 8-year-old. And there wasn't anybody around. I heard footsteps, and I thought it was my mother because I didn't walk home from school right away. I should have.
I remember briefly they were 8 feet tall. They had black robes and they had hoods on, but I never saw their faces. But I do remember that they grabbed me by my arms with these like spider-like fingers, and they escorted me to the ship, and they held me firm, and they would let me know that I wasn't going to be able to get away if I wanted to. It was more like I had to go. It was my turn. And they told me it was my turn, and I was afraid. I was very afraid.
It was a small being that appeared, telepathically communicated to me that everything was fine, not to worry. And he took me to a seat that had lights above it. These were different colored lights, shone the lights over my head, and communicated to me to remember the lights, and repeated that a couple times. And then he took me back to the front of the ship and took me up into space. And it was beautiful. It was just gorgeous. I didn't want to come back.
It was circular. I just remember compartments. I remember them shuffling me from rooms to rooms. I remember them laying on a bed, and there they were doing an operation on me. And I remember this lady who's been in my life apparently for quite some time. She was standing to my left, and there were two men. They were men. For some reason, I knew that they were men, doctors, I would imagine. They were operating on me. And she kept telling me to look into my eyes, and everything will be okay.
The abductees are persons who are terrorized, traumatized by the appearance of the entities, whether they meet them out in the open or are standing at their bedside in the middle of the night to transport them aboard a ship. And the terror and the trauma continue even after they are brought back to their home. And the abductees display all of the symptoms of a disease or an emotional disorder which is described by psychiatrists as delayed stress syndrome.
If there's any trauma, going back and living it through hypnosis and actually getting a hold and knowing what happened often relieves the trauma, often takes it away.
I think the hypnosis session, when I took it several months after I was abducted, at the time I didn't even believe it myself, but after the hypnosis helped me relax more and understand myself.
In just a moment, we're going to witness an unusual experiment. Dr. Leo Sprinkle from the University of Wyoming is going to hypnotize a young man who had an early childhood encounter with a flying saucer and a creature from another world. Now, in order to help him more perfectly reconstruct his memory, Dr. Sprinkle is going to attempt to return the man to the age of 8 when the encounter occurred. And we're not quite certain what's going to happen here this afternoon, but one thing is for sure. You're not likely to forget it soon.
Okay, Morris, as we discussed previously, you'll be able to relax deeper and deeper, faster and faster, letting the entire body relax deeper and deeper, letting the toes and feet, ankles and calves, knees and thighs, hips and torso, hands and wrists, arms and shoulders, neck and head, letting the entire body relax deeper and deeper, being able to go back in time, back to the experience, being able to talk and describe your reactions to the experience. It seemed to descend rapidly, and it appeared that it had landed on the far side of the wood from us. We were amazed at what we'd seen. We couldn't believe it, hardly. We noticed as we looked up, and even after it had landed, there seemed to be something, little like particles falling from the sky. It reminded us of light snowflakes, but not as real. It's just, you could almost see through them. As we got closer, Roger and Eric saw him pointing something at us. And we all began to feel a tingling sensation. Not real intense, but all over. And this began to frighten us. First impression was like a midget. He was completely in a uniform, or what was like the spacesuits I'd seen on TV. He had the helmet, and the suit was white. The helmet was white, and it had something over the front, over the face. It looked very much like a person might have looked.
In a few moments now, you'll be returning to the normal state, coming back from that experience, back to this time and place, feeling fine and feeling good. If you wish, you can just count mentally from 1 to 5, counting from 1, 2, 3, coming more and more to the normal state, feeling fine and feeling good. 4, now wide awake at 5, wide awake and feeling fine. How are you doing?
Okay.
How did it feel to you as you just went back to the memories? It's
real.
Yes.
If you could, the day after, remember everything that they did to you, you might wind up committing suicide or taking a leap off of a bridge, and maybe by slowly filtering out through hypnosis. It's like taking a safety lid off very, 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 very slowly, instead of just ripping it off and letting it, take off.
How could I handle it as an 8-year-old? There's just no way.
I think a lot of people are terrified of the idea that of what's behind that missing time. And what often happens is they find good experiences and benevolent beings. And it's just getting over that initial fear of not knowing, and I'm afraid of what I'll find, and coming to terms with yourself and saying, I need to know for my own mental health.
I'd like to see the scientific community to begin to seriously study this phenomenon. Many of them have been intimidated because they're afraid of being ridiculed for studying a quack field, as it's been labeled sometimes. I think it's because it's only through our scientists getting involved and that we're going to get to the bottom of it, I think, really. I mean, it's gone on too long where they just totally ignore all this hard evidence, people with marks, people who have all kinds of problems. I think it's time that they stop playing games and got involved to help us, because we need it.
Primarily, the intent of abduction investigators since the Hill days has been to analyze abduction narratives and find out the characteristics of the aliens doing the abductions, any kind of communications that they've been relaying to the person that they're subjecting to this experience. But I think now the emphasis is more on therapy and realizing that the abduction victim is a victim.
I think people, if they're going out and they feel that they've had some kind of a UFO encounter and they feel like they want to talk to somebody in a supportive sense, they have to be smart shoppers. Because just because you've got an MD on your wall or you've got some official UFO placard on your desk doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be ethical, you're going to be fair, you're going to be caring.
I'll put you through the speech that I give to someone I'm working with. I'll say, my primary responsibility is to you. I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a physician. You've been through something troubling to you, and I'm concerned about your health, your mental health, your physical health, and that you be okay. So if it comes to a choice between are we going to have a philosophical discussion about what this all means, or you become a subject of my scientific investigation, that becomes secondary if you are in need of talking with someone about what you've been through and helping to put this into some kind of place in your life so you can go on living your life.
I think that the fear and terror that's involved has to do with the loss of control and what you see, the combination of those two things. And so does the anger, primarily with the loss of control. But it doesn't always have to be like that. It can be that there can be a degree of volition involved in these experiences. I think we can all get beyond the fear and terror, and I agree with Larry wholeheartedly that on the other side of it there is going to be a very, very different type of experience. To my mind, where the people who have had this experience must now go is down that strange, winding, dark path, on the other side of which lies no fear.
I don't know about the strange and winding dark path, but I know that fear is fear and terror is terror. It's not like there's a special brand of it in red wiggly letters reserved for people that have had what we call abduction or subjective experiences of this kind. Fear and terror of any level can be dealt with and moved through.
As a psychiatrist, one of the questions that I had to take very seriously was I dealing with some kind of category of psychiatric illness with which I was familiar, or maybe some new kind of psychiatric illness. And the way I looked into that was to apply the various categories of psychiatric diagnosis with which I am familiar. First of all, psychosis, or common madness, or were these people crazy? But not at all. The people that I've worked with intensively, they're ordinary. In every other aspect of their lives, they relate well. They form good contact with me or with other human beings. Their sense of reality is very strong. They have appropriate emotionality in relation to what they're talking about. There's just nothing about them that seems at all psychotic or crazy. So that simply doesn't hold up.
I've looked closely at all the possibilities that I'm aware of that could explain the abduction phenomena. I've gone through every psychological, psychiatric category, which I'm very familiar with, and I don't find anything there except post-traumatic stress disorder, which is clearly the result of a person experiencing a bizarre experience outside their normal realm of experience. And so that makes sense. You have to have a real event for them to have that reaction. So that more or less proves that something went on.
Also, the psychological tests that have been done by a woman named Parnell in Utah, Elizabeth Slater in New York, my own testing that I've had a PhD psychologists do, over and over again, the same result comes through, which is that these are people who are like in a mild or moderate post-traumatic syndrome. They've been through something disturbing. There's that edge of distrust and anxiety that people that have had a trauma have experienced, which the psychologists say can be accounted for by the experience, not by anything in their prior personalities or that can be considered a psychiatric problem separate from the trauma they've undergone.
I've been working with psychologists and a clinical social worker now for over 2 years on studying abductees. It's difficult to get people to cooperate, to sit down and take psychological tests and so forth. They all think they're guinea pigs and so on. I understand that. So we have a small sample of people, about 20 or so people. I think we've learned some things, and I think one of the things that we've learned that's most critical is that in some of these people, in fact, do have mental health problems, let's put it that way. Some of them, in fact, serious enough so that they should probably seek treatment, as we've recommended in a couple of cases. I'd say about half the people we work with have such problems. And their abduction experiences are basically just like other people's abduction experiences. Now, Bud Hopkins and others have talked about how abductees are normal people. And of course, some of them certainly are, but a significant fraction of the ones that we've studied are not. And I think anybody who's trying to figure out what's happening with the abduction experiences has to take that into account.
It is so mysterious, it is so strange, that somehow we want to explain it. We want to fit it into some sort of structure of thought, reality, experience that we know about that will account for it. And where I am with it, we can't do it. There is no theory at this point, nothing in my psychiatric experience, no clinical diagnosis, nothing in mythology, nothing in folklore, history of each one of the folkloric explanations, though attractive in terms of previous times, people thought they were taken by fairies and goblins. Those phenomena look at superficially similar, but they don't have the hard-edged reality that this appears to have. And so I'm left with that this is a great mystery and has a great deal of meaning to it, but I can't account for it.
So you're working with somebody who you can't really give a final answer to. You can't really tell them that it stopped happening, that it won't happen again. You certainly have to admit the possibility that it's going to happen to their children. It's a possibility. What good news are you bringing them? All you can do is to help them accent life here, which we try to do when we have our support group meetings. We try to accent having a nice time. It's kind of a party. People drink a little wine, have some coffee, and there's a lot of fun. But I always tell people not to dwell on the experiences if they can help it, because if you do, you're in the position of the epileptic who spends all day worrying about the next seizure, and your life goes by if that's what you do. So the point is that if we could be more successful in stopping it or giving final answers, we would be happier people. In the meantime, it's strangely like working with someone who has the bleeding disease. I forget the name of it. There's that constant loss of blood, so to speak. It doesn't end.
These are some of the problems with the current abduction research and hypotheses. The hypotheses, leading one being aliens, and the research being, what's the quality of it and so forth. One big problem. People say there are millions of abduction cases or hundreds of thousands or something. If so, how come we don't see them happening? How come other people don't see abductions happening? Second problem is, okay, so we don't see them happening. How are people taken from their rooms? People are allegedly taken through windows by the aliens, taken through walls by the aliens. Do we really believe that's happening or not? It troubles me that we don't have any explanation for it. A third problem why shouldn't we believe the current ideas is that I think the research has been very poor, and I'd like to see much better documentation. For example, why don't we have documentation about false pregnancies? Why don't we have better documentation about these scars? I think without that, it's fair and reasonable for a skeptic to not be convinced by the current evidence.
I would like to think that there are no aliens out there abducting people, and that 100% of all the abductions are nothing more than severely repressed traumas of one kind or another that are coming to the surface in an alien space-age format, perhaps caused by child abuse or some other kind of trauma inflicted upon a child at an early age. But we don't have enough evidence to show that that's the case. Many of the people that come to UFO researchers seem to be very normal in many ways, and there's no clear evidence that that's the case in all circumstances. So I have to leave the option open that some of these reported abduction cases are what they on surface appear to be. And until it either happens to me, and then I know, or think I know, or until we are able to do more of a universal survey of these reports, I'm quite firmly on the fence. I just hope the fence isn't barbed wire.